to Keynes's dislike of the dialectical rhetoric that Marx was using. To some extent, it's a question of translating the rhetoric into terms that are accessible to modern economists. We find also in the manuscripts evidence of affinities between the views of Sraffa and Marx on scientific method, objectivism, and ideology. Sraffa was acutely conscious of the tendency for ideological elements to infiltrate scientific work. And here I quote from another passage from around the same time. The distinction between value judgments and empirical or objective scientific knowledge. This trite distinction has recently gained popularity among German economists. They always think in terms of it, having newly been stated by Max Weber. Unless it is taken in a purely practical, common sense fashion, it is exceedingly stupid. Its success is due not to the don'ts that it implies, but to its affirmative part. The fact that it gives the economist the faculty of saying something which has scientific validity, which must be accepted by laymen as the truth ascertained by science. It is therefore constantly used by economists to smuggle under its cover their value judgments, which they label as objective knowledge. Thus, according to Weber, the professors may show the political parties the facts with which you will have to reckon, but the facts are infinite. And with what criteria will the selection be made? This is a point that Dodd made in his 1973 book. Then the facts have to be described. Is it possible to do this objectively? A typical case is that of Pareto. I only say what the consequences of free trade and protection are. Paraphrasing Pareto. Free trade leads to an increase of wealth. Protection leads to the destruction of wealth. Now, I'm not telling you what you must choose as an economist, but these are the options. In the same folder, we find a fragment in which Sraffa remarks on the difficulty of formulating a truly objective theory. And this is a passage that I like a lot. The subjective moral point of view has so deeply permeated every element in economic theory that hardly anything survives if that is removed. On all we look upon as being good or bad. The very notion of cost is so intimately interwoven with bad, and that of product with good, that by removing the moral element, the very distinction is washed out, the very distinction between cost and product. Nonetheless, he says elsewhere, it should not be thought that theories devised or accepted generally for partisan purposes have no scientific value. They contain elements of truth, which is of scientific value, and is added to knowledge, and seldom is lost again. I would just note this last phrase, and seldom is lost again, might be considered a little puzzling in view of Sraffa's acknowledgement in the preface to Production of Commodities that the classicals had, by the early 20th century, been in fact lost. He uses the term submerged and forgotten. But the quoted passage was written in the late 1920s, part of several notes for a general scheme of the book, and that was early in his thinking on these matters. He does refer several times to exploitation in the manuscripts, but from what I perceive of these references, he was mainly interested in the technical aspects of Marx's discussion of the phenomenon. And in particular, he was interested in how Marx's discussion of the redistribution of surplus value in accordance with the uniform profit rate condition might illuminate the relation between the wage share and the profit share. His remarks indicate that he wished to sequester the ideological implications of the concept of exploitation away from his analytics. In a short fragmentary note on Ricardo and Marx's theory of value, he jotted down the following how the fact that profits are proportional to labor implies exploitation, not in the moral sense. This moral sense is not in the theory of value. And now I come to my conclusion. A final affinity between Sraffa and Marx can be found in the role that Sraffa initially intended to assign to intellectual history in production of commodities. His manuscripts contain an enormous number of documents on the character and the evolution of classical political economy and on its displacement by marginalist theory. He was a perceptive and highly original intellectual historian, and I think that taken together these documents amount to a peerless exposition of the development of economics from the 17th century through to the first 3 decades of the 20th. And I would venture to say that the publication of these documents will spark a thorough reevaluation of the social and economic thought of the 19th century. Evidence from the manuscripts indicates that Sraffa's original plan was to publish a larger work that would present a fully developed account of his interpretation of the classicals and would connect that interpretation to the analytics of his price equations and to his implicit critique of orthodox capital theory. At an early stage, he appears to have considered the historical dimension of the project to be more important than the formal analytics. In some notes dated November 1927, he described the project as he then envisioned it. And the notes are called The Approach of the Book, and here I quote, "The only way is to present history in reverse, that is, the present state of economics, how it was arrived at, showing the differences and the superiority of the old theories, then to expound the theory. If chronological order is followed, Petty, Physiogras, Ricardo, Marx, Jevons, Marshall, it is necessary that it be preceded by a statement of my theory in order to explain what we are driving at. This means first expounding all of the theory, and then there's the danger of ending up like Marx, who published Capital first and then did not manage to complete his Histoire des Doctrines. And even worse, he was unable to, this is the important point in this passage, even worse, Marx was unable to make himself understood without the historical explanation. My plan is to lay out the theory, which is really the essential element, then to make myself understood, for which it is required that I proceed from the known to the unknown, from Marshall to Marx, from disutility to material cost." Sraffa's remarks in the preface to Production of Commodities, he remarks in the preface that while the book was being put together out of a mass of old notes, little was added. And I would say that in retrospect, this remark is pregnant with irony, because yes, of course, little was added, but a tremendous amount was set aside, and what was set aside was precisely the historical material that would have made the constructive purpose of the book much more apparent than, in fact, it was in the published version. And we can only speculate about Sraffa's reasons for omitting this material. From what I've seen of the manuscript, I see no clear evidence about when or why he abandoned this idea of presenting the model in its full historical context. Certainly a number of considerations entered into the decision. He might have concluded that the historical material would distract rather than clarify. He might have felt that the historical material needed to be given sharper focus. And when you look at the enormous quantity of notes, that's quite plausible. But if it needed to get to be put into sharper focus, that would have involved a further delay in the publication of the analytical results, and perhaps even not delay publication further. I suspect that the explanation may be a little bit more subtle, and may have something to do with the still imperfectly understood intellectual affinities between Sraffa and Wittgenstein.